Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season is underway in just a couple hours. And before you guys set your final lineups, here are 8 things you need to know before week 11 of 2024 fantasy football. All right, let's start the video off with CeeDee Lamb now going into Monday Night Football listed as questionable, as we were already not worried enough about CeeDee Lamb with no Dak Prescott and Cooper Rush or Trey Lance or whoever we're going to get at quarterback here in week 11 on Monday Night Football. Now we've got CeeDee Lamb going into the week questionable with a back injury. Now, head coach Mike McCarthy has come out and said that it's non-serious. He's not concerned about it. But who in the world really knows what's going to happen here? Maybe we have CeeDee Lamb in a situation where he's like, the season is lost. Why am I going to risk my body? Who really knows what's going on here, right? But at the end of the day, from a fantasy perspective, what we have to consider is that, well, if you're going to go into Monday night with CeeDee Lamb in your starting lineup, there's a possibility that he does not play in this matchup, which is obviously going to impact your starting lineup. And what are going to be the options if CeeDee Lamb does not play? You're going to be running to the waiver wire to potentially pick up Jalen Tolbert, who would then be the next best option, who sits at 26% rostered, or you're going to take a flyer on Devontae Turpin, also of the Dallas Cowboys, because when we go to the Texans, Nico Collins, Tank Dell at wide receiver are not going to be available. And then outside of that, you're really taking a shot in the dark, looking at, John Mechie or Robert Woods in terms of available Texans wide receivers. So unless for some reason Joe Mixon is a flex option for you, or maybe you could take a chance on Rico Dowdle, the options here just are not that great. Now, it is a pretty good matchup for the Cowboys wide receivers going up against the Texans, giving up the 21st most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Ultimately, are we really going to trust wide receivers like Tolbert or Devontae Turpin with Cooper Rush as a starting quarterback in this matchup when the Texans did not look that bad defensively for the most part in week 10? I think my answer is no. So I would say if you are a CeeDee Lamb owner, you need to seriously look at your starting lineup and evaluate what your potential options are going to be and consider benching CeeDee Lamb, which, to be honest, you were probably already considering benching CeeDee Lamb with the quarterback situation going into week 11 anyways. So this is one of those situations as fantasy managers that we absolutely hate. But if you are a CeeDee Lamb owner, you need to make a game plan now and decide what you're going to do as we move into week 11. The next thing that you need to know is that DK Metcalf is returning here in week 11. We have not seen him play since week 7 when he suffered a knee injury against the Atlanta Falcons in a game where he had 19.9 fantasy points, 4 receptions off of 7 targets, 99 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Metcalf has averaged 15.1 fantasy points so far on the season. Gets a little bit of a steep matchup this week against the San Francisco 49ers, giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But hey, if you own DK Metcalf, you start DK Metcalf, right? But I think the bigger impact here is looking at players like JSN and Tyler Lockett, as both of them are coming off of performances in week 9, their bye week this past week in week 10, where they had good fantasy outings. Lockett, a solid 15.3 fantasy points, but JSN coming off of a monster performance, 13 targets, 7 receptions, 180 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 37 fantasy points. JSN has moved up to the wide receiver 17 on the season, even with having a bye week and week 10. So I guess the point being is that with Metcalf on the field, this probably isn't going to be the same situation for JSN or Tyler Lockett. So if you're looking at JSN or Lockett as flex possibilities this weekend, I don't think they're awful options today. But I think that their upside is certainly capped, especially JSN. I just don't think we're going to get another 13 target game. And, Lockett really only had so much volume, just 4 targets, 3 receptions in his last matchup in week 9. Then when we look at week 8, right, Lockett had 1.9 fantasy points against the Bills, and JS had a respectable stat line with 12.9 fantasy points. But I think a big part of it was the game script against the Rams, a lot of volume passing in that game. I just don't quite exactly know what we're going to get here in week 11 against the San Francisco 49ers, but I think that really the true only trustworthy wide receiver in this matchup is going to be DK Metcalf. So if you own Metcalf, feel free to go ahead and fire him up, as you already probably are. But if you own JSN or Lockett, they move down to kind of lower tier flex options here in week 11. Next thing that you need to know in that same matchup, we've got George Kittle listed as questionable. Now, this game is in the later windows, so hopefully by the time this video comes out, or by the time you're watching this video, we have some sort of update on George Kittle. But at the time I'm recording this on Saturday night, he is still listed as questionable, dealing with that hamstring injury that has kept him as questionable all week long. So obviously, if Kittle plays, this is a good matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, allowing the 21st most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and Kittle's your tight end 1 on the season, even with the bye week, and even missing week 3, and even with only having 8 fantasy points in week 1. So obviously, if Kittle starts, we are starting George Kittle. But the issue is, we might not know until a later period in the afternoon. And once those earlier games have started playing, obviously you can't start any one of those games, which takes away a lot of streaming options at tight ends. So the question really becomes, what are you going to do if George Kittle does not play? Because you're going to want to start George Kittle, right? So I would say look to Will Dissly, who has a strong matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals as a strong streaming option who may be available. The Bengals have given up the 28th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and that is obviously the Sunday night game. So he's a strong option. Then you could also take a look at Dawson Knox, who's coming in, filling in replacement of Dalton Kincaid, who's going to miss this week, as the Chiefs have given up the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So if you're stuck in a bind and you're trying to wait it out here, see if you're going to be able to start George Kittle, there are some good streaming options at tight end in the later window between Dawson Knox and Will Dissly. I personally prefer Will Dissly, but I think Knox is fine. If we get word that George Kittle is ruled out earlier, there are other options like Pat Freiermuth going up against the Ravens in a strong matchup, or Hunter Henry against the Rams in another strong matchup that I like as potential streaming options. And of course, if George Kittle plays, hey, don't stress out here. He's good to go. If he's called good to go, you're starting George Kittle. We'll see what happens. But this should help you guys get a little bit more prepared in the event that Kittle does not play here in week 11. All right, next thing that you need to know is that we got Mac Jones starting at quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence ruled out already earlier in the week. And what are we going to get out of the Jaguars this week? Who in the world knows? But if you are a Brian Thomas Jr. owner, you're definitely stuck with a little bit of a conundrum, as he still has average 13.3 fantasy points per game, although he's had 6.2 or less fantasy points in his last 2 games since the Trevor Lawrence injury occurred in week 9. And even in that game, I mean, Trevor Lawrence still played the full game. Nonetheless, this is a good matchup against the Lions, giving up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And there's always garbage time, right? But man, Mac Jones was really rough in week 10 against the Vikings. 14 of 22, 111 passing yards, 2 interceptions, and a lost fumbles. So I think most Brian Thomas Jr. owners probably aren't starting him, but I feel like, based on questions I've got this week on live streams and on comments, it's kind of split here. Some people willing to take this matchup, take a chance with Mac Jones at quarterback. Maybe it's a little bit better with another week of practice under his belt, or I should say another week as the starting quarterback in terms of practice. But this is a road game. This Lions defense might come out and just smother the Jags. They're going to do great things offensively, I would say, in this game, is what all of us are expecting against the Jags. So I'm worried about Brian Thomas Jr. To give you guys my answer, I prefer to not start him. It was a good matchup last week. The Lions ranked 31st against wide receivers, right? Guess what? The Vikings rank right under them, 30th against wide receivers. So I do think that there's a strong possibility that the Lions game plan very well here at home, and it's not a good day for Mac Jones and company. But I could see a world where this matchup is good enough for Brian Thomas Jr. and he gets enough done here. But ultimately, I'm leaning towards sitting Brian Thomas Jr. if I own him here in week 11. Next thing that you need to know that you probably already know is that Nico Collins is back. He's off the injury report. He's going to play here in week 11 against the Dallas Cowboys. A good matchup here as they've given up the 18th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But it almost feels like they've been worse, and I don't really have any fear in terms of the secondary whatsoever here in week 11, given the state of the Dallas Cowboys right now. So a couple implications here. I mean, I think Nico Collins, I don't think there's anything to worry about in terms of this injury, right? I mean, I read reports that he could have played in week 10 and that the Texans chose to not play him. But ultimately, like I said, good matchup here. I'm not worried about the injury. He's had 21.3 fantasy points per game. He was the wide receiver 1 before he got hurt in week 5. He only had 2 catches in week 5 and had 15.8 fantasy points. He's got a nice little stretch here: Dallas, Tennessee, Jacksonville. I know Tennessee ranks relatively high against opposing wide receivers, but I'm not too worried about it. Texans do have an inconvenient bye week in week 14. They then do have 2 tough matchups against Miami and Kansas City before a great matchup in the fantasy playoffs against the Baltimore Ravens. But all these game scripts should be competitive as the Texans kind of duking it out for playoff seeding and all that stuff. So Collins going to be a strong start for the rest of the season, and you're starting him if you own him in a primetime matchup on Monday Night Football. We're going to see Nico Collins get plenty of targets in this game. But more importantly here, what does this mean for, well, everybody else? I think this is a good thing for Tank Dell. I know Dell has had plenty of inconsistency since we've seen Collins go down, but he's also had some very good games, having double digits in 3 out of the 5 games without Nico Collins. He did have that goose egg in week 7, and then he wasn't so great this past week against the Lions in a good game script, and where he should have, ultimately walked away probably at double digits, but ultimately he's been solid. But I would argue that he'll be even more solid with Nico Collins on the field and opposing defenses applying all that defensive pressure to Nico Collins, which should open up things even more for Tank Dell like we saw last season. So Tank Dell, I think, is a very strong start this week as well against the Dallas Cowboys. And I think, especially in softer matchups as the season progresses, with Nico Collins healthy, we're going to see even potential higher ceilings for Tank Dell. So if you own Tank Dell, have some confidence in starting him this week. I don't think his fantasy value just tanks here because Collins is going to be on the field. We've seen this offense exist with, more than one wide receiver throughout the entirety of the season between Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell. So now that we have Collins and Dell, good to go here. Have plenty of confidence in Nico Collins, but don't forget about Tank Dell. I think he's also a strong start today here in week 11. One line that I'm absolutely smashing on Underdog this week is Nico Collins' total receiving yards, currently sitting at 71.5 receiving yards. Nico Collins has hit that in every single game on the season that he has played in. Great matchup this week. I think he's going to be involved heavily right away to get him back into the swing of things. Love this line on Underdog. I would head straight to Underdog. Take the over on Nico Collins' total receiving yards. And if you don't know, all new users to Underdog who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are getting a free NFL Pick Em for week 11. Take your free Pick Em. Take the over on Nico Collins' total receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you guys are a new user to Underdog and you sign up with promo code TheCatch, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick 'em for week 11 and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. The next thing that you need to know is that Nick Chubb, I think, is a nice sneaky start here in week 11. We talked about him in the sneaky starts and streams video. And you might be saying, Nick Chubb, yeah, it's Nick Chubb. Of course, he's a good start, but you probably shouldn't be saying that. He's had 10 or less fantasy points in his 3 starts on the season, 5.2 or less in 2 of those 3 starts on the season. And the only reason he had 10 fantasy points in week 7 is because he stumbled into the end zone. Really, his stats have not been that great on the season in his return, and the Browns overall have not been that great, right? They got the win in week 8, but I mean, Jameis Winston could have lost that game off an interception several different times. Nonetheless, here on the road in week 11, this is probably, I would argue, the best chance for Nick Chubb's best overall fantasy day in all of 2024, as the Saints are giving up the 29th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. This run defense has just been awful. And we look forward on the season, it's an incredibly tough stretch in terms of strength of schedule against opposing running backs. After week 11, they get Pittsburgh, Denver, Pittsburgh again, Kansas City, Cincinnati, and Miami. You are looking at all top 12 units against running backs in fantasy football in that stretch. So if you own Nick Chubb, you need help due to injuries, due to bye weeks, whatever it may be. Even if you have to throw Nick Chubb in at the flex, I think he's a strong option here in week 11 in a strong matchup against the New Orleans Saints. This is really a matchup where both teams should be able to move the football. I don't quite know that defense is going to be a big part of this game. We'll find out with Derek Carr and Jameis Winston. Sure, turnovers could be there and defense could show up, but ultimately, I think this is a strong spot for Nick Chubb. We should see some wide receivers like Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, maybe even Elijah Moore, as well as David Njoku, the tight end position, get involved today. Should see some red zone opportunities, and I think this is going to be a solid fantasy day for Nick Chubb. So if you own Nick Chubb, you need to start him today. Don't be afraid to start him. I think he should be absolutely solid here in week 11. Another running back that's I think is going to be absolutely solid, who I don't think many people will argue against, is David Montgomery. We talked about him in the must-start video earlier in the week, and I still think David Montgomery has to be a must-start player this week. I've still gotten questions here at the end of the week about David Montgomery, who's averaged 15.4 fantasy points per game as the RB11 on the season, and I think some fantasy managers are just a little spooked because he's had 12.6 fantasy points in 2 straight games, 14.9 or less fantasy points in his last 4 games. But I think this is the game where we see David Montgomery bounce back to a high ceiling game. I would say 20 plus points is not out of the realm, as the Jacksonville Jaguars are giving up the 30th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Now, the Jags have really struggled against pass catching running backs, so sure, I think Jahmyr Gibbs could have a huge game as well. He's the RB5 on the season. Don't get me wrong, he's going to be the running back more involved in the passing game. But my guess here is that the Lions are going to get up early on the Jags, and the Jags are going to struggle in this matchup. Who knows? The Jaguars surprised us against the Vikings in week 10. But ultimately, I think this is going to be one of these games where they have David Montgomery close things out. They play a lot of smash mouth football. I think we might see some fireworks early, but I think they're going to get Monty involved as the game progresses. He closes this one out. I think he could score 2 touchdowns in this game. I think this could be a very good stat line overall for David Montgomery. And I think you could make that argument for any Detroit Lions player today with how bad the Jags defense is overall. But I just have that feeling that this is going to be a big David Montgomery week. If you own him, don't bench him just because the ceiling's been a little bit lower the past couple of weeks. He's still a solid start on a week basis. He's averaging over 15 fantasy points per game, top 12 running back on the season. No reason whatsoever to bench him in this matchup. And like I said, I think he has a shot at a very high ceiling here in week 11. All right, last thing that you need to know that we have talked a lot about so far on the week is that Russell Wilson is the best option in terms of a streaming quarterback here in week 11, going up against the Baltimore Ravens, giving up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks thus far on the season. Russ averaging 19.3 fantasy points per game. And really that number, I would argue, should be a little bit higher because he should have had more than 13.8 fantasy points against the Giants in week 8. We saw 2 touchdowns, 2 George Pickens called back in that game. So let's say 1 touchdown doesn't get called back, right? Then you see at least 19 fantasy points in that game as well, which would slightly elevate that average fantasy points per game number. But ultimately, really, when it comes to Pittsburgh Steelers this week, I love just about every player, but the 3 players that we really want to take a strong look at in terms of matchup are Russell Wilson, George Pickens, and Pat Freiermuth. If you own any 3 of these players, I think they need to be in your starting lineup. we look so far on the season, the Ravens have given up the 26th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Great spot for Pat Freiermuth. They've given up the 32nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Phenomenal spot for George Pickens. And then against the quarterback position, like we've discussed, giving up the 31st most fantasy points. So they are a good run defense. We all know that, as they've given up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. But we should see a good game script here. We should see both offenses be able to move the football. Once again, you never know in these divisional matchups, especially a divisional matchup between two teams like the Steelers and the Ravens. We could see offense stall a bit. You never know. But on paper, this is a fantastic matchup for all of the primary starters for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Even if Najee Harris has a lower ceiling due to matchup here, the game script should benefit him. We could, of course, see him stumble into the end zone. And at worst, he should see enough volume to have a solid day. But the upside lies with Russell Wilson, Pat Freiermuth, George Pickens. And then I would say one of these wide receivers, maybe Mike Williams, maybe Calvin Austin, also benefits in this matchup. And of course, if you own any of the Ravens' primary starters, Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, sneaky guy, Rashad Bateman, they're all worth starting in this matchup due to game script as well. This should be one of the best games of the day. But point being, you own a Pittsburgh Steeler, they're all set for great fantasy days due to matchup on paper here in Week 11. If you need a streaming quarterback, I've said it all week long. I'm going to say it one more time. I think Russell Wilson is the best streaming option at at quarterback going into Week 11. That'll do it for today's video. There are 8 things you need to know before you set your final lineups for Week 11 of 2024 fantasy football. Like always, guys, if you need anything whatsoever moving into today's slate of games and into Week 11 of the fantasy season, be sure to drop me a comment. I will get as many comments answered before the games start on today's video, and I will do my best to get every single comment answered as I usually do. And on top of that, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we have everything you could possibly need on a weekly basis to help you guys dominate your league each and every week as the season progresses. So with that, I'll say good luck to you in Week 11 of 2024 fantasy football. And of course, as always, thank you guys so much for watching and listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.